recently about some decorative wraps that I was experimenting with, and one of the things I was messing around with was invisible wraps or transparent wraps. And I mentioned in that video that I wanted to pick up some silk thread to try that out. If you didn't see that video, I'll put a link up here in the top right hand corner of this video, and you can go check that out if you like. And I don't have any footage of it, but I did my first test wrap and it didn't turn out the way I wanted it to. I had problems with air bubbles getting trapped in the tunnels alongside the guide foot. And I also had a hard time getting the thread to go completely transparent on the blank itself. I needed to back the tension off a little bit. And I also didn't pack my threads as I wrapped. In fact, what I figured out worked best to keep my threads just a little looser was to back the tension off and wrap several turns ahead before I packed the threads together, and that helped just enough to let the epoxy go where it needed to go in order to wet the thread completely out. So what you're seeing here is actually the second wrap I did. I backed the tension off quite a bit in my threads. I think what was happening was it was hard for air to get out and for the epoxy to completely encapsulate the thread in order to make it wet completely out. The extra tension I had on it I don't think helped either. It probably pulled the threads tighter against the blank and made it harder for the epoxy to completely soak through. The kind of thread I bought was kimono silk thread from Superior Threads. The color number on it is 374, and I bought a spool that has a little over 1,000 yards. And this thread is very fine, and it's much finer than most of your rod wrapping threads will be. I'm somewhat used to working with thin thread anyway because I use a lightweight machine embroidery thread that is much lighter than even size A rod wrapping thread. So there wasn't a huge learning curve to move to this even smaller diameter silk thread as far as doing the actual wraps go. And I did one other thing that was a little different was I left a small gap at the front of the guide foot. And the reason I did that was because I wanted epoxy to be able to get air coming in and going out. Kind of like if you were casting metal or something like that, you need air to be able to move in and out in order to keep you from getting bubbles or voids. The end of the tunnel by the guide itself has a gap there naturally, because of how far it stands off of the rod blank. There's a little space there. On the front end where you go up the guide foot, up the ramp there to get your thread started, there really isn't anywhere for air to go on that end if your threads are fairly tight together, and I think that's what was causing some of my problems with my air bubbles. On the epoxy itself, I actually thinned it with denatured alcohol to where it was almost watery, and my plan on this wrap would be to do such a thin coat that it barely covers the threads with that initial coat of thinned epoxy. Then I'd probably go over that again with just my regular epoxy without it being cut with denatured alcohol in order to level everything out the way it should be. There were a few areas still that were more translucent than transparent, and I figured out that if you move the threads around just a little bit with either a tool without any sharp edges, kind of a rounded over metal tool is what I used. I think it's used for clay work or something, but I use it when I'm building rods for packing threads and various other things. By moving the threads around with that tool, and I also used a needle in some really fine areas. I used a sewing needle. Just by moving the threads around with the epoxy on it, I was able to get it all to completely wet out, and it all went completely transparent. And I think it turned out really nice for a second attempt, and I think that's how I'll do them in the future also. But I just wanted to pass along those tips there that might help somebody else out if they're trying to do transparent wraps.